Our world abounds with symbiosis, in the flowers and motley crew of animals which pollinate them, in the intricate mycelial network, which connects 90% of all plants to soil, in the coral reefs which house 2/3 of all marine life, even in the very cells of our own bodies, and all of complex life which evolved 2 billion years ago. These foundational relationships, these key stitches, weave together the foundations of our world, and we neglect them at our peril. The ivory bones of bleached corals, put these up here. The ivory bones of bleached corals, brown needles of decayed forests abandoned by fungal symbionts, plants flowering to find no one buzzing to carry on their genes. All ongoing incidents foretell what is to become commonplace if we refuse to listen to the intimate relations of all life, including our own. When the keystone falls, the arch crumbles. When the key stitches snap, we all become undone. My name is Benjamin Felser, and this is Key Stitches, Symbiographies for a Distressed Earth, the name of which can largely be credited to Hillary Thompson. And as they mentioned, I am a senior biology major right here. And over the past year, I've been researching and writing about 4 key symbiotic relationships, how they evolved, and how these stories can inform our responses to ongoing environmental crisis. Much of this damage results from Western culture, leading us to perceive humans and other species as individual objects instead of as relational entities. Each of the symbiotic bonds I mentioned offer lessons on how to engage healing by changing the stories we tell ourselves about the world. In the lineage of these ideas, I also want to acknowledge that much of the content and methods I explore here exist at fringes of discourse within Western knowledge systems, and accordingly, an immense amount of my inspiration originates in the works of indigenous knowledge holders and their scholars, including, but not limited to, Potawatomi Nation member and scientist Robin Wall-Kimmerer, and anthropologist Gary Nabin's writings on the Tohono O'odham and other Sonoran Desert peoples. They balance both the competitive and cooperative realities of our world in a way that's often missed by Western ecology and evolutionary biology. So in paying homage to people indigenous to this land, I want to acknowledge that we're currently standing on the unceded territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy, including the Abenaki, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and right here, Penobscot nations. Nations whose sovereignty Governor Janet Mills failed to acknowledge despite ongoing pressures to grant tribal sovereignty through LD 1626 just last week. We have letters here courtesy of the Bowdoin Outing Club and NASA for any who feel called to pressure our state government into action. I'm just going to put them out on the Lost and Found table, and after the talk, if you want to, you're more than welcome to draft your own letter, and then you can send it at the Writing Center tomorrow, because it'll probably be closed by the time you go. But we have a model letter, some more information, and anything else that you might want. Other writers, scientists, and poets I draw from include Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin, Andrea Hairston, Anna Singh, and Rachel Carson, among others. All of whose works I highly recommend, more now than ever. We'll explore the bonds mentioned above through poems, embodiment pieces that I've written, which tell the stories of how these key stitches formed and how they're threatened, rooted in those bonds. I hope you'll indulge a little creative license and explorative personification, but also know all these stories are informed by arduous literature review, a lot of literature review, a lot of this year, and I don't pretend to know what it's like to be any one of these organisms in any of these relationships, but I think even in the scientific process it can inform what questions we ask, and how we tell the stories that we do with the information that we have. So we're going to start off with Twinkles at Dawn, about the origins of eukaryotic or complex life, going on to Ententacled, about corals and the algae which inhabit them from the perspective of the algae, on to Mycorrhizal Openings, exploring mycorrhizal or plant fungal symbiosis from the perspective of a fungal symbiont, and then on to blossoming, about plant-pollinator networks, looking at the perspective of both the plants and the pollinator and the animals which pollinate them. We'll start with eukaryogenesis, the origins of complex life, where bacterium and another simple unicellular organism called an archaeon merged following the Earth's first great extinction event. Slowly, in slime. It's strange how, in primordial depths, one of the most earth-morphing events emerged slowly, in slime, at the bottom of murky waters, amid twinkles at dawn. 2.4 billion years ago, bubbling gases emitted by biology invoked toxicity, which bubbled into being as most life perished. Intoxicated by the novelty of photosynthetic emissions, most life died. In an ocean that had never known oxygen, not at this intensity, they cycled back, falling into fuel for adaptive biofilm, bumptious layers of sedimented life revolving, exchanging food and waste, outbreaths and inbreaths, in orbit. Diffuse lights shimmer through these murky depths, motes twinkling, subsumed in cycles through intermingling cells as oxygen presses sensitive life deeper, opening space for adaptive possibilities of those willing, those capable of change. As tolerance becomes an asset, those below press up against the changing, intermingling, metabolic pathways. Orbits condense as archaea consumes bacteria. Genetic legacies of histories apart merged into a singular lifeway. To wriggle up from muck into open oceans of possibilities. The first eukaryotic life to become tree, beetle, fungus, jellyfish, human, elephant, yeast, chimp. But for now, just another dust mote, twinkling at dawn. We see here that it's only under the stress from the first great extinction, the great oxygenation event, which happened right after the evolution of photosynthesis in a bacterium, that eukaryotic or complex life emerged. Bacterial and archaeal metabolic paths became so intimate their cells merged, and something new proliferated. The origin of species through symbiosis, or symbiogenesis, was championed by the scientist who Dave also worked with, Lynn Margulies. But this idea predates her by decades. This overlooked theory implies that the relationships at the core of speciation may also spell their collapse when sufficiently neglected and disturbed. No one questions the dangers of disorder between the mitochondria and the rest of the eukaryotic cell. But we fail to recognize these relationships in the contemporary conservation issues of our day. The story of corals and the symbiotic algae which evolved within them will help to elucidate what it means, what it feels like to lose that connection. Within my bubbled home, I rest, remembering times when things were less certain, when we floundered and feared and flew in search of a home we didn't yet know. Sometimes, I remember how this intimacy was born from catastrophe, how warming waters stratified nutrients, how it sequestered below all we needed, suffering, starving. In this stress, vast possibilities upwell in water stripped of sediments, clear sunlight pouring through novel possibilities for corals and algae in need. We weren't digested, but ententacled in a coral embrace. They fed us nutrients as we offered sugars, bonds terraforming through the intimacy of time, alongside millions of microbes, fish, eels, sharks, urchins, algae, fishermen, among, beside, inside, above us. And all I need to do is live. Live and breathe. Breathe and share the fruits of my life, spinning sunlight to sugar. You can't imagine the pain of knowing, of watching oxygen manipulate my controlled enclosure, invoke chemical wrath. The pain of knowing there is no other way for me to respond in this heat, my being is simply toxic. So the bubble constricts, coral compresses, and I become hurtled into the unknown. As the home beneath me, all I've ever known becomes bleached, skeleton, ghost. If only I could have known how to scale back, how to stop poisoning the only home I've ever known. the home which is a ghost without me. If only I could have, you know, you see, behind eyes shuttered closed, behind one-way mirrors and eyes veiled shut. But you distance in time as you poison in space. Yet bleached earth abounds in your present. If only I knew how to tell you what is coming if you don't listen. You don't listen. You don't stop pumping heat outwards, stop dumping your waste, so you choose to forget within your bubbled home. Our negligence reflects an inability to understand how symbiosis exists beyond this horribond as well. And to be clear, our refers to myself and others in the global north, and especially militaries and petrochemical companies together, which are responsible for 92% of all global emissions, driving ocean warming and coral bleaching. Their collapse disproportionately affects the 500 million people who live around them and depend entirely on them, primarily in the global south. They're necessary for food, tourism, other sources of income, meaning, and as barriers for storms. And while the impacts will be felt most strongly there, they will ripple out to affect all of us. Maybe by rooting, our roots can branch through mycelial fungal networks to tap into our inherent interconnection with other worlds. And so we turn to plants and their mycorrhizal or root symbionts. Resting in my carbon fortress of lignin and cellulose, I release treasures into open root tips, burrowing within their cavities. Leaning into the fibers which interbraid me, I sneak through crevices in search of captive nitrogen, phosphorus. Recalcitrant resources I transform into sumptuous offerings. Your roots beckon. Come here. I'll guide you through. To the core of nourishment. We exchange ancient signals of intimacy. Yes, I am who you think I am. I unburden myself of offerings. I have something for you, I call. I brought it just for you, if you'd like. In response, a flood of carbon, stuff of life, rushing like endorphins to overflow my hyphae into vast networks beyond crevices, around corners. Overflowing abundance, it sprouts, exudes from my threads, feeding the bumptious fray of bacteria who offer me micronutrient nourishment, who encompass me, guiding me to root, defending my networked being. They clamber across my form to find new lives, new homes. El Camino Real for microbial migrants, searching. We carry evolutionary legacies of exchange 500 million years deep. As carbon careens about open skies, exhaled from open mouths, inhaled into gaping leaf tips, spun into crystalline sugars, to be shunted down towards open roots, into open threads, branching into earth, into me. But what if you didn't need me? What if you disappeared? As suffocating abundance plugs all sites of intimacy, and fertilized hyperfecundity obviates the need for mutual aid, and I starve as you choke on the promises of a green revolution. But how much you lose in pursuit of increased yield. You know I've always protected you from pestilence, how I sucked water when little was near, how I held the soil sticking around your vulnerable form. What waste? To see so much slough away alongside my threadbare corpse. How you suffer in my absence. Agricultural industrialization evoking realizations of how much we need each other. In the meantime, my spores are waiting, resting patiently, to again branch within your carbon walls. Mycorrhizal networks weave the foundation of terrestrial ecosystems. But twin threats of excess nutrient runoff from fertilizer or eutrophication and habitat destruction threaten this key stitch. Fertilizer use neglects the ancient legacies of dialogue between fungi and plants which predate all of terrestrial life as we know. Mycorrhizae form vast subterranean networks known to increase water and nutrient use efficiency, protect against pathogens, and reduce erosion by up to 400%. With fertilizer use increasing 500% since 1950, and both logging and fires deforesting 2.5 million acres of land a year, neglecting mycorrhizal symbiosis is disastrous. But turning to above-ground networks, we may see how plants and pollinators may show us what could flower in our current moment of catastrophic change. Blossoming. Expanding into the fullest form of myself. Flourishing, incandescent, an aromatic exposition of all I've come to be. Is this what bees smell? My forms of bees, moths, bats flutter over parched skies to islands of enflowered vitality. Buzzing, clambering, flapping vehicles for genes, propagating pollen granules grounded in my moth fuzz, bee fluff, bat fur. Sometimes I remember my vibrance all those eons ago. 200 million years ago, the first flower bloomed in the damp, dark depths of the Triassic jungle. Flowers no larger than a pin tip, enjungled by giants who made home for me in their shadows. Home where others had been upturned by dinosaurs, and I could root, clinging to specks of light, brief openings in the canopy that shielded me, muffled me. As parts of me learned flowering, insect pieces learned that floral nectar, fecund fruits, could be just as nourishing as leaves or decomposing flesh. So where do I grow when the world opens before me? I flowered in shadows of upturned earth, but now all is unearthed as meteorite and below-ground magma birth flooding fires. A year of winter under ashen skies, under hundreds of meters of calcified ash, still latent under millennia of soil sedimentations. Just 67 million years ago. Ending the reigns of dinosaurs 200 million years long. 80% of all earthly life gone. This closest great extinction. This closest boundary between what was and what's become. What we've become. How many flowers bloomed in the eaves of those ashes? Sometimes I'm nostalgic for those who waved to and fro above me, who shadowed the expansive blueness of sky. Shadows of shadows still linger in memories. And how my leaves grow broad, and how they leap from direct sun, afraid of its excess. And how things have changed. Here I sway, buzz, flutter, flower, float, crawl, into fluttering, buzzing, flapping emptiness, where there was a flower at this time last year. But rains came early this year, too soon for heat to signal time to bloom, and so I flutter in languid loneliness of what remains, descending, lifeless. Hopefully it's different next year. It's moments like these when I remember those damp, dark depths. And those first flowers under dense canopies, when I first graced myself in pollinating pleasure, blossoming. Over half of non-ice Earth is converted to homogeneous agricultural fields and pesticides. As over half of non-ice Earth is converted primarily to homogeneous agricultural fields, and pesticide toxicity is increasing for insects, including pollinators, by up to 200% in places like the US. Changing environmental cues may be the least of pollinator concerns. They terraformed the world after a meteoroid opened our current age, and we stand at another turning point. But we turn faster than biological evolution can accommodate, at least without gargantuan losses of life. Unlike corals and plants, we can choose whether or not to expel our symbiotic cohabitants. We can choose how to tend to these key stitches, how we can regenerate through change, through symbiogenesis. Human presence is not antithetical to environmental health. These relationships emerge through the reality that precarity is better met together, and we have the capacity for change. I take inspiration by anchoring myself in Refugia, clusters of key stitches that exist around spaces of deep local abundance and vitality. These clusters are touchstones for ecological resilience, and they have much to teach us. This will be my last poem. Refugia. I've been thinking about refugia. How they form, how they grow, how they break, how they live, how their identity depends on scarcity. If not here, right now, then there sometime later. When the water stops flowing everywhere else, when the fire burns everywhere else, when the land below is too hot and all that's left is the snow, the forest, the springs above the grasping reach of encroaching heat. When scarcity blankets the landscape unevenly, broad-winged hummingbirds still chirp about the springs. Ponderosa pines still waft caramel scents above the desert. Children still laugh through bubbling waters. I've been thinking about how resilience isn't about size, but depth. Of the water you hold, the soil in which you root, the relationships you nourish, the life you steward. But when do refugia become islands? No, even Hawaii intermixes with Polynesian archipelagos, with the United States 2,500 miles away. When do refugia become islands lost in space, planets? When do the lives safeguarding their connection, allowing for that admixture of adjacent genetic pools, grow too thin, atrophy to the barest of threads, snap, barren, stranding, starving? What would a politic of refugia feel like? To feel into a gentle knowing that rooting here will brave the greatest pains, that rooting here, like the cottonwood, like the mesquite, in this point of energy, pushing taproots deep into rock, into soil, which nourishes your capacity to bear flowers, for bees buzzing in your boughs. Seeds for the birds in your branches and the mice in your roots, mice for the rattlesnakes among your rocks, for the eagles soaring over your crown, carbon soaring through these roots for fungi, bacteria, insects, interweaving among you. Holding soil which breaks down your leaves, branches, mice, birds into soil. Holding water, holding nutrients, holding you, holding on. When I find myself lost in these deserts, these open oceans of doubt, when the heat waves of their despair crash over me with every oil spill, every pipeline through indigenous land, every part per million of carbon forced into the atmosphere, every species, every bond snipped vacant from this earth, I locate the cumulus clouds hovering over these refugia. They beckon to us like Polynesian sailors use clouds to locate reefs in their journeys over open seas. Seas so vast, land itself was miraculous. Like birds mapping reefs by the sense emitted from billions of coral exhalations powered by algal symbiosis. They guide me in their local abundance. Make me aware, make me notice. What we pay attention to, we nourish. And what we nourish grows. Patchwork refugia have always sustained deserts where water only exists in sparse perennial springs, though they're growing more sparse. Patchworks have always sustained boreal forests where nutrients exist in sparse deposits, collected and dispersed through expansive fungal networks, though eutrophication suffocates their bonds. Patchworks have always sustained our oceans where shallow coral reefs create 70% of all fish, sharks, eels, fishers with abundant food and inviting homes in nutrient deserts, though the heat of our ignorance estranges and bleaches them. Our world is falling. But we might stitch together these patchwork connections with our own communities of love, mutual aid, social justice, repair. Stitch them with the strength of hope, or maybe hold them with an embrace of equal audacity to the insanity of how greed, gluttony, and power jeopardize them. Refugia, which we recognized, which we listened to, which we nourished, which we healed, which we are. These key stitches tell stories of a symbiotic past, and our futures will depend on how closely we listen. Thank you.
For that.
Before I go to Q&A, I do want to thank, from the bottom of my heart, Dave and Hillary. Everyone knows, this has been a year. And without both of their unabating care, their belief in me, and unabating, jaw-dropping insight, this project would have been a pale shadow of everything that it is. I wanted to thank you for helping me create art that I couldn't be more excited to share with the world. Kind of really starting right here, honestly. For me, Bowdoin's been a place where it's felt very hard to be seen and actually engage with the things that I'm really passionate about. And I couldn't express more gratitude for how much I felt and known that you've supported my fits of passion and everything that this project has blossomed into. It wouldn't have been possible without our tripartite symbiosis. Yeah. So yeah, thank you all. Yeah. We can do a little bit of Q&A if people have any questions. That was a lot of information.
Which relationship did you tackle first?
I actually went chronologically in terms of like what I showed you. That was the way that I kind of did it. So I've like done a bit of like research into like mycorrhizal symbiosis first. That was kind of like what spawned this entire like passion project. But in terms of the writing, it started with eukaryogenesis, because I was like, dang, like our literal cells are like the products of like symbiosis like 2 billion years ago. Like how do people say that this isn't something that's relevant to evolution or to conservation when it's literally the cells of like the vast majority of the very least like the biomass of Earth. Like bacteria are literally everywhere in abundance, they're way more, but like in terms of like the amount of stuff there is that's alive, almost all of it kind of like stems from that. So that's kind of what I started with. And then I was like, you know, what's kind of like that, but maybe more relevant, charismatic. So I went to corals, and I was like, I really like fungi and trees, and I feel like they're probably really important, and I didn't know that they were literally the only reason why we have life on Earth as it exists right now. I don't know if he's still here, but Bruce Colbert was saying, he was like, you can't say that this is the only way this could have existed. All you can say is that this is how things do exist. So I'm careful about like, the language that I use now. And then I feel like plants and pollinators, they're a lot more like spatially like distributed. So that can be more difficult to conceptualize, but it's also something that like something that I found also while doing this was that all of these happened like right after periods of really intense catastrophic change. Like 90% of all plants are flowering, and they only really like radiated after like the giant meteorite came and destroyed the age of the dinosaurs, other than birds. And like it's kind of crazy that all of these like incredible cooperative relationships that have created space for so much more life than existed before only happened after those like intense moments of change. And so part of me was like, that sounds familiar to some things going on right now. Samir?
You mentioned that the idea of eukaryogenesis was a thing before the women sort of like really like talked about it. I was wondering if you could tell us more about that.
Yeah. So Samir was asking about eukaryogenesis and how I was mentioning that people knew that like eukaryotic life, or people were talking about how eukaryotic life had evolved through kind of like that symbiosis, like two organisms that ended up having like a really positive, mutually beneficial association, coming together and becoming one. So it's really complicated because when something's right, inevitably there are people that have been saying it that are like both like really intelligent and really insightful, and you're always going to have a few like nutcases that are like, I knew that all along. So that's a little bit more difficult to distinguish. I think I'll speak specifically to symbiogenesis, because that was an idea that was started, it was a lot more popular among Russian scientists, which, if you know things about Russia at the turn of the 20th century, that makes sense because socialism and communism. And so you see a lot of that ideological influence informing like the theory around biology. So in the US, that's one of the reasons why we have such a difficulty kind of like metabolizing these ideas, even within empirical scientific communities, especially after World War II. Because this idea was in pretty wide circulation before, and people were talking about like moths and yucca. You'll have one moth per species of yucca, that yucca flowering plants, and it's such a tight symbiosis, it's literally 1-to-1. That was when people were like, this is crazy. This doesn't seem like what like people are talking about in the context of Darwin and like tooth and nail evolution. Also plants, people were finding that like it seemed really clear to at least some that chloroplasts in plants were also originally bacteria. And I don't know if this is a very clear answer, but basically there was a lot of this dialogue before, and it was really after World War II that was kind of like the siphon in the wake of kind of like post-war industrialization, and especially the Cold War in the West. A lot of these more like I'd say nuanced ideas ended up being kind of like siphoned out as just kind of like romantic conceptions of nature that deny kind of like the realities of like competition, tooth and claw. And then she came about in like the 60s with this crazy like massive paper. Not everything she said was true. Not everything that she said until she died is something that everything people believe in. If you want more, you can talk to Dave about that, because he knows a lot more about that than I do. But even then, there was an immense amount of resistance until the techniques of like molecular biology were able to say definitively, no, this DNA is from a bacterium. Karen?
Do you struggle to like balance how much science versus like poetry to include in your poems, or how did that process work?
I'm laughing and looking at Hillary because there's some of like my so basically the way that this works is in the fall I was writing, and it kind of snuck into this year too because deadlines and everything. So I wrote 4 like 2,000 word pieces on each of these relationships, and this semester I just had a weekly practice of every Tuesday for an hour I would just write and see what happened. And I wanted to write embodiment poetic pieces for each of these. So these always came after I'd already written the piece on them, and after I'd really written all of those pieces. So I had the general trends and themes in my head as I was just like, I wonder what I'm feeling today. And it was often a lot more of the science, and then I would talk to Hillary, and then she'd go, what does this mean, Benjamin? Or what does this mean, Benjamin? And then I would realize that I was I was using a little bit too much. So it was kind of like I don't know. But sometimes it's kind of okay to use words that like aren't going to be legible to the entire public, when sometimes they sound nice and align with like the aesthetic of the poem. But when there's enough of the context, I feel like I was still fine with it. But I tried to like think about like, if I were to give it to like my sister who doesn't want to hear anything about the things that I have to say about science, like would she still be interested in it? Yeah, what is it?
Why use poetry as a medium to express these ideas? To make this call to action and give this information?
That's a really good question. I think the first answer is because I like it. And I feel like some of these stories are just like so dramatic, and scientific papers don't capture that. Like, I really wanted to challenge myself to like really synthesize these into like the key ideas, and then learn how to communicate that in a way that helps people like feel an emotional connection to even like one version of what these could have been. I feel like when we've been talking in a lot of in classes that I've been in, or even like Perrin and I did an abroad program. The last 2 photos that I shared were from that program, and Perrin was in the Refugia photo. We were talking a lot about like environmental healing and how so much of it comes from a sense of disconnection. And when the majority of the work that's going to like do this labor is happening in academic circles, where a lot of it is like people for example, like in Mexico, the largest funder of conservation research is Germany, but none of that research stays in Mexico. It all goes back and stays in the academic circles there. Like that doesn't make sense. So I think that would be really interesting to tell these evolutionary stories, so they really are stories, from the standpoint of like starting really like with emotion, with like how you build an emotional connection. And then if you want to, then you can read kind of like, you can like get into the literature from there, because that's where like honestly the majority of the information is. And like I oversimplified a lot in the poems, but like you can't build an emotional connection by like only using numbers. Like that's like, I don't know. I wanted it to be something that would speak to people who are looking for that sense of like meaning and connection, because that's something that I've also been personally wrestling with. So that's just like, I'm just generally looking to like places where like art and feeling and emotion are being brought more into these places, because it's been at a personal level immensely cathartic, because I don't always know what to do with all this information. because it's really scary and it like causes me anxiety, and putting it into art feels like a meaningful way to kind of like engage in communal catharsis, and then also start thinking about how to like rebuild connections, because it's impossible to do any meaningful work without having connections. And that includes like, we know that with like human communities, but it also includes like interactions between human and non-human communities too, I think. That answer. Is that Lucy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about how every once in a while there's an idea that sounds like really romantic and radical, like brought forward by like a nutcase, and that's like later supported by like actual science and methods. I wondered if you had done anything about it.
I didn't hear that last part, sorry.
I wondered if you had done anything about like the guy or the idea that like the entire system is like a dynamic.
Yeah, so I haven't read enough about that to really have like a concrete thing to say about it. Lucy was asking about the Gaia hypothesis, which is an idea posed by Lynn Margulies, who was the person who was talking about eukaryogenesis, and also this atmospheric scientist, I think, James Lovelock. The idea that like, the Earth is one self-regulating entity. It's one of those things that's just like really complicated. I honestly, I could say kind of like offhand thoughts, but I don't think that I've done enough. I don't know enough about it to really. It makes sense that the Earth would be self-regulating to some degree, but whether that composes like one like conscious entity is something that I don't know. I think it's like it's honestly something that I really like to believe, but I don't know enough myself to know if I do. Yeah. Yeah. This was saying it could be something that's really meaningful to engage with poetically. I totally agree. Yeah. I think we can take like one or two more questions. Yeah, Ahmed?
So my question was more about you and this project, but what are kind of next steps for you, not career-wise, like after Bowdoin, with this project as well?
Ahmed's out here asking about my career path. I recorded a shorter version of this, and I'm going to be presenting it in this like virtual expo for this like global like network of people interested in regeneration, and so that'll be happening on May 14th. I have like a total of 4 essays like I mentioned before, and then these were just 5 of like the 12 poems that I've written. So I'm going to have those all on a website that I'm going to try to like organize in some creative way that like also aligns with these ideas. And that'll be released in an ideal world on May 14th, but no later than May 17th, because I don't want to do work after finals ends. And I want it to be ongoing. Like I really want to continue having this be an excuse to engage with poetry. I'm going to be working as like a supervisor at my summer camp this summer, which will be really cool as an experiment, just thinking more intentionally about like social networks and the communities that we like create in stewardship of like the land that like I grew up kind of returning to every year in like around Yosemite. And then afterwards, I really want to learn how to support community-based conservation work. The Refugia poem actually happened like after, like literally like, same as a conversation I had with Louise and Dia, where we were talking about how not to get like overwhelmed by all these things. And that combined with like my reflections on like parent of my experience like in Arizona had me thinking about like how I'm not somebody who feels like I can change everything, but I can maybe support the work that's happening locally. And so people who have like lived on particular places of land for generations and generations know what that land needs, and there are spaces where Western science can be useful, and that's really what I'm trying to learn how to do. So I want to go to grad school, but I don't know what that's going to look like yet, and I don't know exactly where I'm going to be. Yeah. Okay, one more question? Yeah, Zoe?
How does Buddhism and spirituality science? I know that this project was very science focused and it was birthed from scientific thought, and also very spiritual person. So I want to know maybe
Yeah. Zoe was asking about the relationship between like my experience of like Buddhism and spirituality more broadly and its connection to this work. Zoe and I were both in a course, like an 8-week course on the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Zen priest. And I think that one of the pieces that I gleaned from it, which isn't entirely Buddhist, is the importance of embodiment in this work. That a lot of like what, at least like, especially like Western mindfulness talks about in the context of like liberation, is like fully inhabiting your body and its relationality with other bodies. That personal identity isn't something that is like definite, but is always in dialogue between like what you might identify as like the cluster of relationships that is yourself and everything else around it. So that kind of like dialectic selfing is something that I was leaning on a lot. That these relationships, the coral is changed irrevocably by touching coral, by touching algae. And the algae is changed irrevocably the moment that it stepped inside the coral. And understanding that like we're all changed continually by our relationships, and that itself is really related to kind of like the Buddhist idea of codependent origination, that nothing exists on its own but only in the context of kind of like the vast relationships that we all have, whether it's like light and dark, or like sound and silence, or like, I don't know, me and this, that they're all kind of like illusory relative ideas. And being able to understand that through embodiment, I think, is the core of that. And also, like, I've always felt like a really strong sense of like connection and love and like unity with like a lot of the natural spaces that I've been in. And I think that also touches that too. But that's something that I think is kind of like the next step of my own personal journey, figuring out how that relates to Buddhism, how that relates to like my connection to Judaism, because I'm ethnically and ancestrally Jewish. So that's kind of like next steps. Oh, thank you all so much for coming. This is great. I'm going to stick around for a bit and I'm going to set up the stuff.